All right, so buckle up, because today we're going deep on the Commodore 64.
The C64.
Yeah, the one and only. We're going to figure out what made it such a huge phenomenon back in the day.
It's really a fascinating story.
It is. I'm already geeking out just thinking about it. So we've got a Wikipedia article to get us started, a pretty in-depth YouTube documentary, even some stuff in German, which I'm hoping you can translate for me.
No problem.
All right, so let's get into it. What made this thing, this beige box with, honestly, kind of terrible keyboard, such a legend?
You know, the funny thing is the C64, well, it didn't actually start life as a computer.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it kind of came out of this failed gaming console, the Max machine.
The Max machine. Okay, so a flop turned into one of the best-selling computers ever. How'd that happen?
So the Max machine, even though it bombed in the market, did have some pretty awesome tech inside, especially
Right.
its graphics and sound chips, the VIC and SID chips.
So these chips were like next-level stuff.
Yeah, totally revolutionary for the time. But the Max machine was limited by its RAM. It only had like, I think 16 kilobytes.
Wow, 16K. That's tiny.
Yeah, and it didn't have basic programming, so it was basically just a fancy game console.
So it's like you have a Ferrari engine, but you put it in like a riding lawnmower.
Yeah, all that power, but nowhere to really use it. But luckily, some engineers at Commodore saw the potential, with these awesome chips.
They were like, hold on, we could do something with this.
Exactly. So they took those chips from the Max machine, added a keyboard, gave it a full 64 kilobytes of RAM, and that's where the name Commodore 64 comes from, of course, and they integrated BASIC.
Boom, the C64 was born.
Yeah, pretty much.
I bet Jack Tramiel, the CEO of Commodore at the time, was pretty happy when they unveiled the C64 at CES in 1982.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they were undercutting all the competition with that $595 price tag.
Tramiel was a smart guy. He knew 64K of RAM was expensive back then, but he figured the prices would drop during production, and that would give them a real edge in the market.
So he kind of played the long game.
He did, and it paid off big time.
I mean, imagine being Atari or Apple, seeing this new computer come out of nowhere. That could pretty much do everything yours could, but for way cheaper. Talk about a nightmare.
Yeah, I'm sure they weren't thrilled.
They must have been like, how are they even doing this?
Well, part of the answer is pretty simple: vertical integration.
That sounds complicated. What does that even mean?
So basically, Commodore owned the factories that made the chips, so they controlled the whole process from start to finish.
So they cut out the middleman, kept the costs down.
Exactly. It's kind of like the Ford Model T of computers. Mass production, make it affordable for everyone.
Yeah, I get it. But low price alone wouldn't made it a hit, right? I mean, there had to be more to it.
Right. They also marketed the C64 really well, like really aggressively.
Yeah, like those crazy 80s commercials I've seen on YouTube.
Probably. And they made sure you could find it everywhere, not just in those fancy electronic stores, but in regular department stores, too.
So while other computers were sitting in specialty shops, the C64 was right there next to the toasters and TVs.
Exactly. And you have to remember, this was the early 80s. Home computers were still pretty new for a lot of people.
So the C64 wasn't just a computer. It was like this whole new world opening up.
Yeah, a gateway to this exciting new digital realm.
I love that. A digital realm. It sounds so, I don't know, mysterious.
And once they figured out some supply chain problems, particularly with those 1541 disk drives, the software started pouring in. Games, applications, everything.
Oh yeah, the 1541 disk drive. I've heard stories about those. Weren't they notoriously slow?
They were, but we'll get into that later.
Okay, good, because I'm ready for the dirt on those things. So the C64 had all this software, something for everyone. No wonder it sold like hotcakes, right?
Millions and millions of them.
I mean, to think that this little machine from the 80s with its 64K of RAM is still relevant today is kind of mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredible.
Okay, so we know it was cheap, widely available, had tons of software, but why should we still care about the C64 today? What's its legacy? What does all this mean for us all these years later?
Well, its impact goes beyond sales figures, that's for sure. It really changed the way people thought about computers, brought technology into homes, even sparked this creative revolution.
Yeah, I mean, the documentary talked about how a lot of people got their first taste of programming on a C64.
For many, it was their first experience with game design, even online communities.
You mentioned online communities. I remember reading about Quantum Link, something about Habitat too, right?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Look, I love when you say that.
Remember how Commodore made some smart choices with the hardware, like including that user port that was compatible with their older machines?
Yeah, the VIC-20, right.
Yeah.
made it easy for people to upgrade.
Exactly. But that user port it also opened up this whole other possibility, modems.
Modems, so people could go online with their C64s.
Yeah, connect to services like Quantum Link.
This is blowing my mind right now.
Quantum Link was really ahead of its time. It had all these features we take for granted now: email, chat rooms, online games, even shopping.
Wait, people were doing all that back in the mid-'80s on a C64?
Yeah, they were. And it was all text-based, no fancy graphics or anything, but the basic idea was there. It's like a glimpse into this alternate timeline of the internet.
That's wild.
And Habitat, that was even more crazy.
Okay, so tell me more about Habitat. What was it like?
Well, picture this: a graphical world where you could walk around as an avatar, talk to other people, trade items, all kinds of stuff.
So it's like an early, super basic version of an online game.
Pretty much. But more than just a game, it was this whole social space, a real community.
It's incredible to think that people were doing all that back then on a C64.
It was groundbreaking stuff.
So basically you're saying that the C64, this little beige box, helped lay the foundation for the internet as we know it.
In a way, yeah. It's amazing how these things are all connected.
Well, my mind is officially blown. But we've talked a lot about the history, the impact. Let's get down to the nuts and bolts. What made the C64 so powerful for its time? I mean, it outsold Atari and even the NES in those early years. What was going on under the hood that made it so special?
Well, a lot of its power came down to those custom chips we talked about earlier, like the MOS 6510 processor and the VC2 graphics chip, and of course the legendary SID chip for sound.
Ah, yes, the SID chip. I've heard so much about that one. All right, let's break those down one by one. First up, the MOS 6510. What made this processor stand out from the others?
So the MOS 6510, think of it as like the brain of the C64.
The brain, okay.
It was basically an upgraded version of the 6502 processor, which was in a bunch of other 8-bit computers like the Apple II, the Atari 800.
Okay, so it was a popular processor back then.
Yeah, but the 6510, it had some special tricks like better input-output and this thing called memory banking.
Memory banking. Okay, you got to explain that one to me. It always sounded kind of like magic.
Okay, so imagine you have this tiny desk, right? But tons of papers you need to work with.
Sounds like my life.
You could try to cram everything on there at once, but it would be a total mess.
Oh, it would be a disaster.
So instead, you have a filing cabinet where you keep the papers you aren't using right now.
And then you pull stuff out when you need it.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's kind of like memory banking. The C64 only had 64 kilobytes of RAM, which isn't much.
Especially by today's standards.
Right. But with memory banking, it could access extra memory, so it could run bigger, more complex programs.
That's pretty clever, squeezing more out of less.
It was a neat workaround. So yeah,
Mhm.
memory banking helped the C64 do more with what it had.
Okay, that makes sense.
Oh.
What about the graphics? I know the VC2 chip was a big deal.
The VC2, yeah, the video interface chip 2, it handled all the visuals.
And it could display 16 colors, which is a lot for back then, right?
Yeah, 16 whole colors.
Right.
And it could do sprites for smooth animation, even different graphics modes for the programmers to work with.
Sounds impressive. But I read that there were some limitations with the colors, something about restrictions within the character cells.
Yeah, that's right. So the VIC2 could display 16 colors overall, but not all of them within a single character cell, those little 8x8 blocks.
So like within each block you were limited.
Yeah, and that led to some creative solutions from programmers. They did things like color cycling, dithering, to make it look like there were more colors.
Color cycling, dithering. Okay, you're losing me a little.
Okay, so color cycling, that's when you switch between different colors really fast to make things look like they're shimmering or moving. Think of like those twinkling stars in old C64 games.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean.
That's often color cycling. And then dithering, that's like using patterns of pixels to create shades and gradients that weren't really there.
Kind of like an optical illusion.
Exactly. So even with the limitations, the VC2 was pretty powerful. Programmers just had to think outside the box.
I bet they did. Okay, let's talk about the sound, the legendary SID chip.
The SID, or sound interface device, that's where the magic really happens. It was a 3-channel synthesizer chip designed by this guy, Bob Yans, who later went on to co-found Ensoniq, a synthesizer company.
So this guy knew his sound?
He did, and it's amazing how he got so much out of just 3 channels. It's got this warm analog sound that's totally unique.
People still rave about the C64's music today. It's pretty incredible.
It really is, and you can see how the music evolved over time. Early games used the SID for basic sound effects, but then composers started doing these really intricate scores.
It went from like bleeps and bloops to full-on electronic music.
Yeah, basically. And they even figured out how to do digital audio sampling, so that added a whole other layer to the sound.
So basically, they were pushing the boundaries of what this little chip could do.
Totally. It's amazing what they accomplished with what they had.
Okay, so we've talked about the processor, the graphics, the sound. What was it actually like to use a C64? What would you see when you turned it on? How did you connect it to a screen?
Well, first thing you'd see is that classic blue startup screen, though I know you have strong feelings about that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Blue text on a blue background, talk about eye strain. I always change the text color to white right away.
Yeah, good call. But anyway, the C64 actually had a surprising number of display options.
Really?
You could hook it up to your TV with the regular RF output, but the quality wasn't great.
Yeah, RF was always a bit fuzzy.
So you could use composite video for a cleaner signal, or even connect it to a monochrome monitor if you wanted the sharpest text.
Wait, a monochrome monitor, so like black and white?
Yep, black and white.
Yeah.
It sounds weird now, but back then, monochrome monitors were common, especially for things like writing.
Made sense, especially if you were staring at a screen all day.
And get this, the C64 even had an early version of what we now call S-video.
No way, S-video on an 8-bit computer.
It was called LCA, and you needed a special Commodore monitor, but it basically split the signal to give you a really sharp, vibrant picture.
That's wild. So you could connect your C64 to a regular TV, a composite monitor, a monochrome monitor, or this fancy LCA setup. That's pretty impressive.
It was. Commodore gave you options. So what about programming? The C64 came with BASIC, right?
Yeah, BASIC 2.0, the standard for most home computers at the time. But let's be honest, C64 BASIC was not exactly user-friendly, especially if you wanted to do anything cool with graphics or sound.
Well, it had its limitations.
Limitations is putting it mildly. You practically had to be a coding wizard to get it to do anything beyond basic text.
You did have to get creative. A lot of peeking and poking into memory to get the graphics and sound chips to do what you wanted.
Yeah, not exactly beginner-friendly. Luckily, there were things like Simon's Basic and those super expander cartridges that added a ton of useful commands for graphics and sound.
Oh, yeah. Those were lifesavers for programmers.
They were. Okay, and then there was the infamous 1541 disk drive. We got to talk about this.
Oh, the 1541. Where do we even begin?
It was so slow. I remember waiting forever for games to load. It was torture.
It was notoriously slow and not always reliable either. Commodore wasn't exactly known for their build quality.
But even with its quirks, it was a big step up from cassette tapes. You could actually store and load programs, which was a game changer.
It was. And of course, there were third-party solutions to speed things up, like that EPYX fast load cartridge.
The EPYX fast load, a true savior. Even with all these workarounds, the C64 was starting to get a little long in the tooth by the mid-'80s, right? I mean, newer, more powerful computers were coming out, like the Apple IAGS and the Amiga. Did Commodore just give up?
Not quite. They weren't ready to let go of the C64 just yet. They still had a few tricks up their sleeves, like the Commodore 64C.
The C64C, wasn't that just a redesign?
Right.
Like a new case, but the same insides?
Yeah, pretty much. It came out in 1986, and it looked more modern, but under the hood, it was basically the same machine. But it showed that Commodore was still committed to the C64, even though they were working on new stuff like the Amiga.
So they weren't giving up without a fight.
And they even released GES, a graphical user interface that gave the C64 a whole new lease on life.
GEOS, like an early version of Windows or something.
It was. It had a desktop, icons, Windows, all that. It came with a bunch of applications, too, like a word processor, a paint program, even a spreadsheet. It made the C64 feel a lot more modern and competitive.
So Commodore was really trying to keep the C64 relevant, even as technology was marching on.
They were, and it's pretty amazing how much innovation and creativity there was around this machine, even in its later years. It really shows how limitations can sometimes lead to some amazing solutions.
And it's not just about the hardware and software, right?
Yeah.
The C64 had this whole community around it, people who loved it, programmed for it, made art with it. It was a whole movement.
Absolutely. And that community is still going strong today.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about the C64's power, its limitations, the experience of using it. But we've touched on this idea of online communities, and that's something I really want to dig into. Those early online experiences like Quantum Link and Habitat, they were so different from the internet we know today. But in a way, they paved the way for it, right?
It's crazy to think how those early online communities on the C64 foreshadowed so much of what we take for granted now.
I mean, people were chatting, downloading stuff, playing games online, all on a C64. It seems impossible, but it happened.
It did. Quantum Link was basically a proto-internet. They had email, chat rooms, online games, even online shopping. It was all text-based, but the core concepts were there.
It's like a glimpse into an alternate history of the internet.
And then there's Habitat, which was even more groundbreaking. Imagine this. A graphical world where you could walk around as an avatar, talk to other people, trade items, all in real time.
So it was like an early version of those massive online games we have today.
Yeah, but even more than that, it was this whole social space. People were forming communities, building relationships, exploring this virtual world, all within the limits of a C64.
Mind-blowing to think that they were doing all that back then on such a limited machine.
It really is. They were pioneers in a lot of ways.
So what does all this tell us? What's the big takeaway from the story of the Commodore 64? We've gone from a failed gaming console to this global phenomena that changed computing, gaming, even online culture. What's the lesson here?
I think it's a story about innovation, accessibility, community. The C64 was more than just a computer. It was this cultural touchstone that inspired a whole generation to explore, create, connect in ways that nobody thought possible.
And it reminds us that technology is always changing. But the human need to connect, to share, to create, that's always there.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the power of a machine that, even with its limitations, sparked a revolution and left a mark on the world that's still felt today.
Well said. So there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the Commodore 64. We've covered it all, the ups and downs, the technical brilliance, the quirks, the impact. It's a story of innovation, creativity, and a whole lot of fun.
And it's a story that's still being written. People are still creating for the C64 today, keeping its spirit alive.
And you can experience it too, through emulators and re-releases.
Yeah.
It's amazing that this little machine from the 80s is still accessible to anyone who wants to try it.
You might be surprised at what you discover.
That's right. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Yeah, it's really something, isn't it? Those early online communities, like they were almost predicting the future.
It's wild, right? Like they had a lot of the same stuff we have now.
Yeah.
Just, way more primitive.
Quantum Link was like, I don't know, email version 1.0 or something.
Text only, no emojis.
You had your email, your chat rooms, even games and shopping. It was all, they're just different.
It's like a blueprint for the modern internet, but made out of ASCII characters.
And then Habitat takes it even further. It's mind-blowing they were doing this on a C64.
Like, how did they even fit a whole virtual world on those floppy disks?
Well, it was a lot simpler visually than the games we have now, but still.
But the core idea is there. You've got these avatars running around, interacting, building stuff.
And they were really forming communities in Habitat. It wasn't just a game. It was a place to hang out, make friends, even have arguments, probably.
I bet. So all this on a computer with, 64 kilobytes of RAM?
Yeah.
It makes you realize how much we take for granted now.
It really does. Those early C64 users were pioneers, even if they didn't know it at the time.
They were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. So what's the big takeaway here? What does the C64 story tell us about technology, about ourselves?
I think it shows how much we crave connection, how much we want to create and share with others.
Even back then, with those clunky machines and slow connections, people were finding ways to connect.
And the C64 made it possible for a lot of people. It was affordable, accessible, and it sparked this wave of creativity.
I mean, the C64 wasn't perfect. We've talked about its flaws.
The slow disk drive, the interesting color choices.
Oh, yeah, that blue screen. But it was those limitations that forced people to be creative, to come up with workarounds, to push the technology further.
Absolutely. And it's that spirit of innovation, that drive to make something new and share it with the world, that's the real legacy of the C64.
It's a legacy that's still alive today, with people creating new games, music, demos for the C64, even though it's been decades since it was on store shelves.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is. Well, I think we've covered pretty much everything there is to say about the Commodore 64, from its humble beginnings to its lasting impact. It's been a fascinating journey, wouldn't you say?
It has. It makes you wonder what the next C64 will be, What's going to be that game changer for the next generation?
That's a great question, and one we'll have to ponder as we continue to explore the ever-evolving world of technology. But for now, we're going to sign off. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Commodore 64. It's been a blast.
It has. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll catch you next time.